Does this sentence sound wrong? Well, it might not be. Do you know what it means? Stick around to see whether you're right. Grüß Gott, hallo, schönen guten Tag. Ich bin Billy Badger und das ist Bausteine 2. Herzlich willkommen. Now look, we'll come back to this question in a bit, but in the meantime, I want to ask you a different question. How do we describe the location of something? Is it possible to talk about where something is without using a preposition? And if you've forgotten what a preposition is, we're talking about those little words that help us to talk about the relationship between two things, like in, on, at, behind, above, below, and so on. Think about how we in English describe where something is, and you'll see that we mostly compare its position to the location of something else. Take, for example, this little wheel here. To describe where it is at any one moment, we could say it is behind this massive P, next to it, on top of it, in front of it, in it, between it and the next massive P, or even underneath the P. Now, exactly, of course, where you consider it to be will depend a bit on your viewpoint. But you could say in German, das Rad ist hinter dem P, am P, auf dem P, im P, vor dem P, oder zwischen dem P und dem nächsten, oder unter dem P. And here you'll notice, as we've mentioned in a few videos recently, that when we are describing the location of something, we'll generally use the dative. But what I like about these prepositions is that we're getting pretty good value for our money because we can use the same ones not only to talk about where something is, but also to describe how it got there in the first place. So this brings me back to my question from the beginning of the video. Is this sentence wrong? Well, it will depend on what you're trying to say. Am I trying to describe what I did at a particular location? Or am I trying to say how I got to that location in the first place? Well, the key here is, of course, the case. As we've mentioned before, cases let us know what the function of each noun is in a sentence. Used with the dative, these prepositions really only describe a location. Used with the accusative, they will allow me to talk about how I got there. Our sentence uses the dative in der Bibliothek, so it says that whatever it was that the verb says I was doing it in the library. So my going, or maybe my walking, was happening in the library. Now, there'll be better ways, of course, of getting that idea across, probably. But if we wanted instead to say, I went to the library, or even maybe I went into the library, I could use more or less the same sentence, but with the accusative instead of the dative. So for this feminine noun, we'll be using die instead of der. This turns a library into a destination. Let's have a look at some other examples. Now, in the following, I really only want to concentrate on a few prepositions, but most of the others that we talked about at the beginning will work in much the same way. The most important thing for us today is to understand the reasons why we might use the dative or why we might want to consider using the accusative instead. Let's start off then with probably, I'd say, the most common one, in. Wir gehen in die Stadt. Jetzt
sind wir in der Stadt.
We're using the accusative in die Stadt to get across the idea of where we're off to, and the dative in der Stadt to describe where we are. And here we are now at the library. Ich gehe in die Bibliothek. Ich bin jetzt in der Bibliothek. Hier gehen wir in der Bibliothek herum. And again, accusative for going to the library, and the dative to describe our location in the library itself. For the next example, let's enlist the help of the dog again.
Der Hund legt sich gern in die Sonne. Dann liegt er stundenlang in der Sonne.
If we look at the last example, you'll see we're using the accusative in the first part and the dative in the second. Why? Well, that's because that sunny spot is a destination in the first sentence. It's where the dog goes to when he wants to get warm, into the sun. In our second example, we're describing what the dog does when it gets there. Here, the location is the sun, or at least that sunny spot, so we'll use the dative. Sticking with the dog for now, we can also say, legt sich gern vor die Heizung. Or alternatively, liegt schon sehr gern vor der Heizung. Here, using the preposition for, we're expressing much the same thing in each case. But in the first sentence, the dog goes to the heater to lay down, and in the second one, we're just saying where he likes to lie. The end result is, of course, more or less the same. Let's turn to our next preposition, auf. It's often the equivalent of on in English, and if we had to generalize, I guess we'd say we often use this when talking about a position on some kind of horizontal surface. So in this example, Christina might say,
Ich lege die Brötchen auf das Blech. Jetzt sind sie auf dem Blech.
This gives her the opportunity to use our preposition in again.
Ich schiebe sie in den Backofen. Sie bleiben 5 Minuten im Ofen.
Again, we're using the accusative for describing where the bread is moved to, and the dative to describe the location where it ends up. We can also often use auf to describe going to an island or being on one. Here's an example. Wir sind am Wochenende auf einer Insel gefahren. Auf der Insel sind wir viel gewandert. Wir sind am Sonntag auf einen Berg geklettert. Oben auf dem Berg konnte man fast die ganze Insel sehen. In the final example, we use the accusative for the journey and the dative for the location on the island or on top of the mountain. Now, whereas auf gets used often for horizontal surfaces, an will often be used in connection with vertical surfaces, walls, windows, and that sort of thing, like in this example. Wir gehen gern ins Café.
Jetzt gehen wir ins Café.
Im Café setzen wir uns gern ans Fenster. Wir sitzen gern am Fenster. We're using ans Fenster or an das Fenster to get across the idea that when we go into a cafe, we head to the window. This is where we go to. And you'll know that because we're using the accusative. But the next sentence, we're back with the dative to convey the idea that we like sitting in this location, am Fenster, at the window. Similarly, an is often handy for referring to the ends of things or the borders between things, like countries, I guess, or as in this case, the border between water and land. Here's an example or two. Wir fahren ans Meer. Wir sind gern am Meer. Wir gehen aber nicht ins Wasser. Der Hund geht ins Wasser. Wir nicht. Es ist Winter. Im Winter ist es zu kalt. Now we're using ans Meer to get across the idea that we are going to the seaside, to that border between the land and the sea. And am Meer to refer to where we are, or in this case maybe where we like being. Now, as always, we're trying to generalize complex ideas and generate patterns, and language usage is often much more complex than we describe here. But you'll be off to a good start if you remember that if we're using these prepositions, then we'll be using the dative to describe location, where we are, and the accusative to describe our movement towards that location or destination. As always, there's lots more information and examples in your textbook Bausteine 2. So make sure you check that out. Also das war's dann für heute und auch für dieses Video. Ich wünsche Ihnen eine schöne Woche und weiterhin viel Spaß mit der deutschen Sprache. Und wenn Sie Fragen haben, melden Sie sich einfach. Have a great week, and if you have any questions, just get in touch. Drop a comment maybe down below. Also auf Wiedersehen und tschüss.